There's a Tuesday afternoon sometime after your 70th birthday when you notice something strange. You're folding towels, and for the first time in longer than you can remember, you're not thinking about anyone else's opinion of how you fold them. Not your mother's voice, not your ex-husband's sigh, not the neighbor who always seemed to notice everything. Just you, warm cotton and quiet. The radio is on low in the next room, playing something you don't even recognize anymore, and for once that doesn't bother you either. A woman named Ruth described a moment just like that. She said the towels weren't the strange part. The silence in her head was. For nearly 60 years, there had always been noise in there. Voices, judgments, corrections. And on that ordinary Tuesday, she reached for a towel, and nothing said anything back. She mentioned it to her daughter that same week, half laughing, half unsettled by her own peace. Her daughter asked her a question Ruth couldn't answer for almost 3 years afterward. "Doesn't that scare you, having all this quiet, this late in life?" Ruth didn't have a good answer that day, but she found one eventually, and we're going to get there because it might be the most important thing in this entire video. Here's what nobody tells you about turning 70, 75, 80. The weight was never really about age. It came from everything you were carrying before you got here. Expectations, grudges, performances, fears, that you are now finally quietly allowed to set down. Today we're walking through 8 specific reasons why life after 70 tends to feel lighter, not heavier, for the people who reach it with open hands instead of clenched fists. Not shallow positivity, not just stay busy advice, not a list of hobbies to pick up. The real shifts happening underneath, in the parts of you that don't show up in a mirror, the ones nobody warns you about in advance because most people are too busy dreading getting older to notice what actually gets easier. And by the end, we'll come back to Ruth and to that question about the quiet. Because the answer changes almost everything. Have you ever caught yourself mid-sentence, softening what you were about to say? Not because it was wrong, but because you imagined how someone might react to it? A sibling, a coworker who retired 15 years ago, a version of your mother who's been gone for decades but somehow still has opinions. Most people carry an invisible committee in their heads, and most people never stop to ask who actually appointed its members. That committee gets built early and for good reason. Belonging used to mean survival. Fitting in with the group meant food, safety, protection, so your brain learned correctly that the disapproval of others was worth fearing. But here's what happens by the time you reach your 70s. You've now lived through enough disapproval to notice a pattern. You said the wrong thing at a dinner in 1987 and the world didn't end. You wore the inappropriate color to a funeral once and nobody actually remembers. You disagreed with your father about something important, and 40 years later, that disagreement is a footnote, not a wound. The evidence has been piling up your entire life. You simply weren't in a position until now to look at all of it at once. Think about the last family gathering where you actually said the thing you were thinking instead of the softened, safer version of it. Maybe you told your son-in-law plainly that you didn't agree with the decision he'd made. Maybe you wore the loud floral shirt your daughter always teased you about, simply because you liked it and didn't rehearse an explanation beforehand. Notice what happened afterward. Not much, probably. A brief flicker of awkwardness, maybe, and then dinner continued, and the world kept turning exactly as it had before. That's the quiet experiment your whole life has been running without you realizing it. Testing over and over whether honesty and preference are actually as dangerous as they once felt. By 70, the results are in, and they've been in for a while. There's also a quieter, harder truth underneath this. Many of the people whose opinions you spent decades managing are no longer here to have them. Some have passed. Some have drifted. Some, if you're honest, probably stopped thinking about you years before you stopped thinking about them. The audience you've been performing for was smaller and less attentive than your anxiety ever let you believe, and by 70 you've quietly gathered enough proof of that to finally believe it. This isn't about becoming careless or cold. It's about recognizing that the price you were charging yourself, constant self-monitoring, constant editing, was based on a debt that stopped being owed a long time ago. There's a concept psychologists sometimes call the spotlight effect, the deeply human tendency to believe other people are noticing and judging us far more than they actually are. Studies on this have found consistently that we overestimate how much attention others pay to our choices, our mistakes, our appearances, often by a wide margin. Most people are too absorbed in managing their own imagined spotlight to spend much time studying yours. It takes most of a lifetime to truly believe that, not just intellectually but in your bones. And somewhere after 70, for a great many people, it finally sinks in all the way down. That's not carelessness. That's clarity finally arriving on time. And once you stop carrying other people's opinions, something else starts loosening its grip too, your relationship with time itself, which we'll get into next. You spent decades editing yourself for an audience that was smaller than you feared and far less critical than you imagined. Letting go of who you performed for is a real kind of freedom, but it turns out it's only the first weight to go. Because the next one you put down is the clock you've been racing since you were young enough not to notice you were running. Time doesn't get shorter after 70. It gets different. For most of your life, time worked like a debt collector. There was always a deadline behind the one you just met. A promotion to chase, a house to pay off, a child to raise, a retirement to fund, a body to keep in working order for one more decade of demands. Time was something you spent under pressure, the way you'd hand over money you needed for something else. You weren't living inside time so much as running from it, glancing over your shoulder to see how much distance you'd put between yourself and everything still undone. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you sat somewhere for 20 minutes doing absolutely nothing and didn't feel guilty about it? For most of adulthood, stillness felt like falling behind. That's the strange psychological inheritance of a productivity-driven life. Rest gets coded as failure, even when there's nothing left to fail at. Something shifts for a lot of people after 70. Not because ambition disappears, but because the scoreboard does. You're no longer being measured against a 5-year plan, a performance review, a mortgage timeline. And here's the part that surprises people the most. Research on time perception consistently shows that when people stop measuring time by how much is left and start measuring it by what's happening right now, satisfaction rises, sometimes sharply. It isn't denial. It's a recalibration. You stop treating today as a means to some future payoff, and time stops being a countdown. It becomes, instead, something closer to a room you're finally allowed to sit in. Researchers who study something called time affluence, the felt sense of having enough time, regardless of how much is actually left, have found it to be one of the strongest predictors of daily happiness, often outweighing income or health status. And time affluence isn't about having empty calendars. It's about the absence of that background hum of racing against something. Think of a grandmother watching her grandchildren build a sandcastle, in no rush for them to finish it, in no rush to be anywhere else, fully willing to watch the tide take it away 20 minutes later without feeling like the afternoon was wasted. That patience isn't something she manufactured. It's what was left over once the debt collector version of time finally stopped calling. This is why so many people describe their 70s and 80s as strangely unhurried, even while surrounded by loss and change and uncertainty. Not because urgency vanishes completely, but because it stops running the show every single hour. A morning coffee isn't a pit stop before the next obligation anymore. It can just be a morning and a coffee. There's something almost physical about this shift, if you pay attention to it. The shoulders drop a little. The breath slows down without any deliberate effort to slow it. People who've spent their whole lives being early to everything sometimes find themselves arriving exactly on time instead. Not because they've become less responsible, but because the 10 minutes of cushion they used to build in out of anxiety simply isn't asking to be built anymore. That's not laziness. That's a nervous system finally exhaling. If you've made it this far, the next part gets a little more personal because it isn't only about opinions and clocks. It's about the things you've been quietly holding on to that were never doing you any good at all. Picture a woman, we'll call her Carol, sitting at her sister's kitchen table one Sunday afternoon. 41 years after an argument neither of them can even fully recall the details of anymore. Somewhere along the way, the specifics blurred, but the coldness stayed, like a draft coming from a window they'd both stopped trying to find. Grudges are strange creatures. We think of them as armor, proof that we take ourselves seriously, that we won't be walked over. But most long-held resentments aren't really protecting anyone anymore. They're closer to a subscription you forgot to cancel, quietly charging you every month for a service you stopped using years ago. Psychologically, holding on to resentment keeps the nervous system in a low simmer of vigilance, The body doesn't fully distinguish between an old wound replayed in memory and a new one happening in real time. Every time you rehearse the story of what someone did to you, some part of you relives it as though it just occurred. That's exhausting at 30. By 70, the body has less patience for that kind of chronic bracing, and something in you starts asking a very reasonable question. What exactly am I still guarding against? Here's what tends to happen for people who reach their 70s and 80s with any real peace. They don't necessarily forgive because the other person deserved it or because the wound didn't matter. They forgive or release, which is sometimes a more honest word, because carrying the weight stopped being worth the exercise. You start to notice that the person you resent may not even remember the argument the same way. May be gone, may be unreachable, may simply be old now too, softened by their own losses. Holding on doesn't punish them anymore. It never really did. It only ever punished the one holding on. Sometimes the release looks dramatic. A phone call after a decade of silence. A letter finally written and finally sent. But more often, it looks almost embarrassingly small. Carol didn't call her sister to deliver some grand speech about forgiveness. She simply asked if she wanted more coffee, and her sister said yes, and that was, in its own quiet way, the whole reconciliation. Nobody apologized out loud. Nobody needed to. The weight had already started lifting long before either of them said a word about it. Simply because both of them had grown tired of holding their end of a rope, neither could remember the reason for pulling. This is different from pretending nothing happened. It's closer to setting a heavy bag down on the sidewalk because your arms are tired, not because the bag was never heavy. It was, you carried it a long way, and you're allowed to put it down without needing anyone's permission or apology first. There's an old idea, repeated so often it's become a cliché, that holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. Clichés earn that status by being true often enough that they stop sounding interesting, and this one earns it honestly. The body keeps a kind of ledger, and every unresolved resentment sits on it as a small, recurring withdrawal. A little less ease at family dinners, a little more tension in rooms that should feel safe. Closing that ledger, even quietly, even without ceremony, tends to free up more energy than most people expect. That's not weakness. That's a body and a mind finally agreeing to stop fighting a war that ended years ago. We're a third of the way through, and if some of this is landing closer to home than you expected, that's exactly the point. Stay with it because the next reason might be the one that surprises you the most. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Whose life have you actually been living, yours or the version of you that other people needed to see? Most people spend decades in roles they didn't fully choose, or chose so long ago the choosing has been forgotten. The dependable one, the strong one, the one who never complains, the one who holds the family together at every holiday, every crisis, every quiet unraveling. These roles usually start from love or necessity or both. Someone needed you to be steady, so you became steady, and eventually the performance and the person blurred into one. The psychological cost of role performance is rarely obvious while you're inside it. It shows up as a persistent, low-grade tiredness that rest doesn't seem to fix because it isn't physical exhaustion, it's the exhaustion of constant self-monitoring, of checking whether you're being who you're supposed to be instead of simply being who you are. Researchers who study identity and aging have found something consistently interesting. As people move into their 70s and beyond, the roles that once defined them, provider, caretaker, the responsible one, often loosen naturally, sometimes because circumstances change, sometimes because the energy required to maintain the performance simply isn't available anymore. And for many, that loosening doesn't feel like a loss of identity. It feels like meeting themselves for the first time in decades. Consider what happens when a lifelong caretaker's children are grown, independent, no longer needing rescuing at every turn. There's often a strange, disorienting grief in that, but underneath the grief, for many people, is a second feeling they don't expect. Relief. Not because they didn't love the role, because the role was never the whole of who they were, and they'd almost forgotten there was a person underneath it. Consider a man who spent 40 years being the strong one, the one who fixed things, who didn't cry at funerals, who absorbed everyone else's panic so the family could stay calm. In his late 70s, at his own wife's memorial, he cried openly for the first time in front of his children, and instead of the collapse he'd always feared that would represent, his son simply put an arm around him and said, "I've been waiting years to see you let that out." Nobody thought less of him. If anything, the room felt more honest with him in it, not less steady. The strength had never actually required the silence. He'd simply never tested that assumption until there was nothing left to lose by testing it. This is part of why so many people in their 70s and 80s describe rediscovering old interests. A hobby set aside 40 years earlier, a way of talking, a sense of humor that had gone quiet under the weight of responsibility. It isn't reinvention. It's closer to excavation. The person was always there. They just had less and less to dig through to find her. Identity, it turns out, was never as singular as the roles made it feel. You were always more than the dependable one, the strong one, the responsible one. Those were simply the parts that got the most airtime because they were the parts everyone else needed most urgently. What's happening now isn't a loss of self so much as a redistribution. Room finally being made for the parts that had been waiting patiently in the wings the entire time. That's not disappearing. That's finally resurfacing. And once you start meeting the person underneath the roles, something else tends to follow closely behind. A new, sometimes uncomfortable, relationship with needing other people. If you're still here, this next part matters even more, because it touches something a lot of people find harder to admit out loud than almost anything else we've covered so far. For most of your adult life, independence was the currency of dignity. You raised children, or you didn't. You built a career, kept a household running, solved your own problems, and probably solved a few of everyone else's too. Asking for help, for a lot of people, quietly got filed under weakness, something to avoid unless absolutely unavoidable. Then the body changes. A knee doesn't do what it used to. Driving at night gets harder. Groceries that once fit easily into two hands suddenly need 2 trips, or someone else's help entirely. And underneath the practical inconvenience sits something much heavier. The fear that needing help means becoming a burden. That dependency is the opposite of the person you spent your whole life building. Here's where the shift happens for a lot of people, and it tends to happen slowly rather than all at once. You start to notice that the people who love you don't actually experience helping you the way you feared they would. Your daughter driving you to an appointment isn't secretly resentful. She's grateful for the excuse to spend 2 extra hours with you in the car. Your neighbor bringing in your trash bins isn't quietly judging your decline. He's glad for a small, easy way to matter to someone. Interdependence, it turns out, was never really the opposite of dignity. It was the thing dignity was hiding from out of old fear. Think about the specific small moment of handing your car keys to your son for a nighttime drive you used to make without a second thought. There's a sting in that, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But watch what actually happens in the car. He turns up the radio to the station you like. He asks about a memory from 30 years ago he's heard a dozen times and wants to hear again anyway. The car ride that felt, in anticipation, like a small death of independence, often turns out to be one of the more connected 20 minutes of either person's week. The burden you imagined and the moment you actually lived rarely turn out to be the same thing. There's real psychological research behind this too. Studies on aging and social connection consistently find that accepting support, rather than resisting it, is strongly linked to better emotional well-being in later life, while chronic self-reliance past a certain point correlates with isolation and decline. The people who age with the most ease aren't the ones who need the least. They're the ones who've made peace with needing at all. There's a particular kind of pride that mistakes self-sufficiency for love, as though needing nobody proves you love everybody enough to spare them the trouble. But the people around you rarely experience it that way. More often, being needed by someone they love is one of the more meaningful things in their own week, not a chore they're quietly resenting. Refusing that isn't generosity. It's accidentally denying them a small, real chance to show up for you. That's not becoming a burden. That's finally letting yourself be loved the way you've been loving everyone else all along. We're just past the halfway point now, and the next reason is the one that tends to quietly undo people the most in the best possible way. Somewhere in your 60s or 70s, a strange kind of relief starts to settle in. The possibility of being wrong stops feeling like a small catastrophe. For most of your life, being wrong carried weight far beyond the mistake itself. Wrong meant unprepared, unprofessional, unreliable, a small crack in the version of yourself you were trying to present to bosses, spouses, children, neighbors. Perfectionism, for a lot of people, isn't vanity. It's armor built early, usually out of some experience where being wrong once cost something real, a job, a relationship, a parent's approval, and the nervous system decided reasonably at the time never to risk that again. But armor is heavy, and it's meant to be worn temporarily, not for 60 years straight. By the time people reach their 70s, most have quietly discovered something that perfectionism never let them believe earlier. Being wrong, even publicly, even often, rarely produces the catastrophe once imagined. You gave someone bad advice decades ago, and the relationship survived. You made a financial decision you'd take back if you could, and life continued anyway, in a different but livable shape. The data has been accumulating for 50, 60, 70 years, and it says something perfectionism never wanted to hear. Mistakes are survivable almost always, and the fear was doing far more damage than the errors themselves ever did. Picture a father, well into his 80s, sitting across from his 50-year-old daughter and saying, plainly, for the first time in her life, "I got that wrong. I should have listened to you back then." He'd carried the specific memory of that argument for 22 years, replaying his own certainty, half expecting that admitting fault out loud would somehow unravel his authority in her eyes permanently. Instead, she reached across the table and held his hand for a long moment, and neither of them needed to say much else. The apology didn't diminish him. It was, as far as she was concerned, one of the most respected things he'd ever done in front of her. More respected, she told him later, than any of the years he'd spent trying never to be wrong in the first place. There's a specific kind of lightness that comes from no longer needing to be right in every conversation, at every family dinner, in every disagreement with an adult child who sees the world differently now. You can say, "I don't know," without feeling diminished. You can say, "I was wrong about that," without it costing you the identity you spent a lifetime building, because you've finally learned the identity was never actually that fragile to begin with. Perfectionism always promised safety in exchange for constant vigilance, but it rarely delivers on that promise, because there's no version of a long life that doesn't include being wrong somewhere along the way. What actually changes by your 70s isn't the frequency of mistakes. It's the meaning you're willing to assign them, evidence of being human, rather than evidence of being inadequate. That's not giving up. That's finally trusting the ground beneath you to hold your weight, mistakes and all. If you've been nodding along so far, take a breath here for a second, because what's coming next tends to be the part people carry with them the longest after watching something like this. There's an old line, often attributed to writer and activist Betty Friedan, that captures something a lot of people only understand fully once they've lived it. Aging is not lost youth, but a new stage of opportunity and strength. It sounds at first like something printed on a greeting card. It isn't. It's closer to a diagnosis of everything we've been talking about so far, because opportunity and strength were never about having more time left. They were about finally having less weight to carry through the time that remains. Think, for a moment, about everything already covered, the opinions you no longer perform for, the clock you no longer race, the grudges you no longer feed, the roles you no longer have to hold up alone, the help you no longer have to refuse, the mistakes you no longer have to fear. None of that lightness came from denial. It came from decades of living long enough to finally see clearly what was worth carrying, and what never was. That clarity has a cost. It usually arrives only after loss, after disappointment, after time spent carrying things that turned out not to matter. But it also has a gift folded inside it, one that younger versions of you couldn't have accessed no matter how hard they tried, because the gift only becomes visible from here, looking back. That's the strange arithmetic of aging that nobody explains in advance. The years take things from you, and there's real grief in that, no reason to pretend otherwise. But the years also take away the weight you were never meant to carry forever in the first place. Both are true. Neither cancels out the other. And most people who reach their 70s and 80s with any real sense of peace will tell you the same thing, in their own words. The second kind of loss ended up mattering more than the first. Have you noticed, somewhere in your own life, a moment when something you thought was a loss quietly turned out to be a release instead? Picture a man sorting through a closet that hasn't been touched in 15 years. Old ties, achievement plaques, a stack of paperwork from a business sold decades ago. He isn't grieving as he goes through it. He's almost amused, holding up an old award and wondering, gently, why it ever felt so important. For most of adult life, clarity about what matters gets buried under an avalanche of what's urgent. Bills, deadlines, other people's emergencies, the next obligation. All of it demanding attention right now. None of it actually telling you what's important versus what's simply loud. Urgency and importance get tangled together so completely that most people never get the chance to properly untangle them until the noise finally quiets down. Psychologists who study values and aging describe something called socio-emotional selectivity, the idea that as people become more aware of time as finite rather than infinite, they instinctively begin filtering out what doesn't serve genuine meaning and investing more deliberately in what does. This isn't decline. It's closer to editing, the same instinct a skilled writer uses on a final draft, cutting everything that doesn't serve the story, except here the story is your actual life. That old plaque doesn't get thrown away because achievement stopped matching. It gets set aside because the man finally sees clearly that it was never the achievement itself that mattered. It was a late night at the office it cost him, a dinner with his kids he missed to get it, a version of importance he borrowed from someone else's definition of success. There's a particular kind of memory that tends to surface during this stage of life, and it rarely involves the things people spent the most energy chasing. Almost nobody, looking back from their 70s or 80s, describes lying awake thinking fondly about a quarterly report or a promotion that came 3 years later than planned. What tends to surface instead is smaller and stranger. A specific Tuesday, an ordinary dinner, an unremarkable afternoon that somehow became the one the mind keeps returning to, uninvited, for decades. That's usually the clearest signal available of what actually mattered, arriving decades after the fact, when it's finally quiet enough inside to hear it. What replaces that clarity, more often than not, is something smaller and far more durable. A phone call with a grandchild that runs 20 minutes long instead of 5. A garden tended without any goal beyond the tending. A friendship maintained for no reason except that it feels good to have it. None of it will end up on a resume. All of it turns out to be what actually made the years worth living. This is, in many ways, the quiet reward hiding underneath everything harder about growing older. The narrowing of energy and time, which sounds at first like pure loss, comes bundled with a kind of forced honesty about priorities that younger years rarely allow, simply because younger years feel like they contain infinite room for everything to matter equally. They don't, and they never did. It just takes decades to be willing to admit that out loud. That's not settling for less. That's finally recognizing more for what it always was. And once you can see clearly what mattered all along, there's only one thing left to make peace with, the thing most people spend their whole lives trying not to think about at all. Remember Ruth, from the very beginning. The quiet after the towels, and her daughter's question. Doesn't it scare you, having all this quiet, this late, with so little control over how much of it is left? It took Ruth almost 3 years to find her answer, and when she finally did, it wasn't complicated. She said the fear was never really about the quiet itself. It was about spending her whole life assuming that not knowing how much time remained was a problem to be solved. Through planning, through control, through staying busy enough not to notice the question underneath everything. What she came to understand, slowly, was that the uncertainty had always been there, every single year of her life, whether she acknowledged it or not. Nobody at 30 knows how much time they have left either. They simply have the luxury of not being asked the question directly. What changed for Ruth wasn't the amount of uncertainty. It was her relationship to it. She stopped treating the unknown length of her life as a threat hovering over the present, and started treating it as the very thing that made the present worth paying attention to at all. A grandchild's laugh on a Tuesday afternoon doesn't need a 5-year plan behind it to matter. It just needs someone sitting still enough to actually hear it. Ruth told her daughter it wasn't one single realization that got her there, but a slow accumulation of ordinary mornings where nothing catastrophic happened. The same way the fear about disapproval had quietly dissolved years earlier under its own pile of counter-evidence. She started noticing that most days simply arrived, were lived, and ended, without the ceremony her anxiety had always insisted they deserved. Somewhere in the accumulation of thousands of those unremarkable, uneventful mornings, the fear lost its grip, not because she defeated it in some dramatic confrontation, but because she simply stopped feeding it enough attention to survive. This is the last, quiet wait so many people set down somewhere after 70. The need to know exactly how the story ends before they're willing to enjoy the chapter they're currently living in. It's a strange trade when you look at it plainly, spending decades of a limited life anxious about how limited it might be, instead of simply living inside the time you do have. Letting go of that isn't resignation, and it isn't pretending mortality doesn't exist. It's closer to what Ruth eventually told her daughter, almost 3 years late but exactly on time. I stopped needing to know how much sand was left in the hourglass. I just started noticing how good the sand felt. Falling. That's not fear finally winning. That's peace arriving right on schedule. So if you've stayed with this all the way through, here's what we've really been talking about the whole time. Life after 70 doesn't get lighter because less is happening, or because there's less at stake, or because you've simply run out of things to worry about. It gets lighter because you've finally lived long enough to tell the difference between the weight that was actually yours to carry, and the weight you only picked up because someone somewhere along the way handed it to you and you didn't know yet that you were allowed to set it back down. The opinions that were never really yours. The clock that was never really chasing you the way it felt like it was. The grudges that stopped protecting you decades before you noticed. The roles that were only ever costumes. The help that was never a burden to ask for. The mistakes that never actually broke anything permanent. The noise that was drowning out what mattered most. And finally, the fear of not knowing how much time is left, which, it turns out, was never solvable, only livable. Ruth is in her 80s now. She still folds towels most Tuesday afternoons. She says the quiet in her head never came back, and she stopped waiting for it to. She'll tell you, if you ask, that she doesn't miss the noise. Not the version of it that used to keep her company, and certainly not the version of it that used to keep her small. If any part of what you heard today sounded like your own life reflected back at you, that's not a coincidence. It's what almost 8 decades of living quietly makes possible for anyone willing to let it. Maybe you're not there yet. Maybe some of these 8 things still feel heavy in your hands right now, today, as you're listening to this. That's all right. Nobody arrives at all of it on the same schedule, and some of it, honestly, may take you the rest of your life to fully set down. But if even one of these 8 reasons landed somewhere true for you today, that's not nothing. That's the weight already beginning to shift, whether you feel it yet or not. If this found you at the right moment, consider staying a little longer. Subscribe if you'd like more conversations like this one. Not because a number needs to go up somewhere, but because there's likely someone in your life, maybe even you, who could use a reminder like this on a harder day. We'll be here when you're ready for the next one.